I did not fall apart. I want to make that clear, because when people hear what happened, they assume I must have. They picture me sobbing on the kitchen floor, or showing up at his office, or doing something desperate and ugly that I would regret later. I did none of those things. When my husband told me he was leaving me for my sister, I set down the mug I was holding, looked at him for a long moment and said, "Okay." He seemed almost disappointed by that. That was 2 years ago. I was 31 years old, 8 months into a fertility treatment cycle that had already cost us more than $14,000, and apparently losing my marriage at the same time. My husband, I'll call him my husband, because that's what he was, even if he stopped acting like it, had been rehearsing this conversation for God knows how long. He had talking points. He actually had talking points. Things about growing apart, about incompatibility, about how the stress of the treatments had changed me. And underneath all of that, wrapped in careful language designed to soften the blow, was the truth. He had fallen in love with my younger sister, Abby. They had been seeing each other for 4 months. 4 months. While I was doing injections in the bathroom every morning, while I was tracking my temperature before I even got out of bed, while I was smiling at her across my own dinner table every Sunday because she came over for family dinner and that's what we did, that's who we were. I said okay, and he left. My name is Wren. I am, as of this telling, 33 years old. I'm an actuary. I assess risk for a living, which has always struck people as ironic given the particular blind spots in my own personal life. I work for an insurance firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. I am precise and methodical, and I have been told, more than once, that I am hard to read. I prefer to think of it as composed. My sister Abby is 27. She is the kind of woman people describe as vivacious, which is a word that always sounded to me like it meant something slightly exhausting. She lights up rooms. She laughs loudly. She touches people's arms when she talks to them. Growing up, I was the reliable one and she was the magnetic one, and we had settled into those roles so completely that neither of us ever really questioned them. My husband's name was Caleb. Is Caleb. He's still alive, obviously. He's a sales director at a medical device company, which means he is professionally charming in the way that certain men are. The handshake, the eye contact, the way he makes you feel like the most important person in the room right up until you are no longer useful to him. I had known him for 6 years. I married him at 26 because I loved him, and also because, I can admit this now, because he felt like the kind of steady, forward-moving life I had always planned for myself. 2 incomes, a house in a good school district, a dog, eventually children. The children part did not cooperate. We had been trying for almost 3 years before we went to the specialist. The diagnosis was mine to carry. Diminished ovarian reserve, the doctor explained in the calm clinical voice that doctors use when they're handing you something that will hollow you out for weeks. It didn't mean impossible, she said. It meant harder. It meant intervention. It meant monitoring and kind of hope that has to be constantly maintained against a very persistent current of disappointment. Caleb said all the right things at first. He held my hand in the parking lot after that appointment and told me we would figure it out together, and I believed him because that was the story I was living, and I had not yet been given any reason to revise it. I found out later that he had started texting Abby somewhere around month 4 of the first IUI cycle, not about anything romantic at first, or so she would eventually tell me. Just checking in, seeing how she was doing, the way you do with someone you've known for years. And then the texts got longer, and then they met for coffee, and then, well, I don't need to narrate that particular progression. You can fill it in yourself. He moved out in November. By December, they were posting photos together, not tagged, not explicit, but visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Which I did, because I knew both of them better than I knew most things in the world. I went quiet. My mother called every few days. My friends are the careful, hovering gestures that people make when they don't know what to say but feel obligated to be present. I went to work, went to the grocery store. I walked my dog, a beagle named Frank, who had no idea anything had changed and remained relentlessly cheerful about it, which I found more comforting than most human contact during that period. I did not contact Caleb. I did not contact Abby. My attorney did. Let me tell you something about being an actuary that is relevant here. I understand risk tables, and I understand how people underestimate low-probability events. The thing that most people get wrong about unlikely outcomes is not that they fail to imagine them. It's that they imagine them and then discount them anyway, because the human brain is fundamentally optimistic in ways that override logic. Caleb and Abby both assumed that I would be too devastated, too destabilized to be paying close attention. They assumed grief makes people passive. They miscalculated. Because while I was very quiet in the months after Caleb left, I was not idle. I was reviewing. Going back through things slowly and carefully the way I go back through risk models, looking for the details that didn't add up. There were several. The first was a beach trip, in October, 1 month before he told me he was leaving. Caleb had taken what he described as a work trip to Hilton Head. Team retreat, he said. 2 nights. He showed me the hotel on his phone like I'd asked, even though I hadn't. It was the kind of unnecessary proof that only surfaces when someone is already preparing their alibi. Abby had also, I remembered, mentioned going to see a friend in Myrtle Beach that same weekend. She'd been vague about it in a way that hadn't registered at the time. I did not rush. I filed this detail away and kept watching. The second thing was financial. We had a joint account that we used for household expenses, and one that I privately thought of as Caleb's personal account, though it was technically joint as well. Around month 5 of his new relationship with my sister, there were consistent transfers out of that account that didn't correspond to any bill I recognized. Not enormous amounts. 700 here, 1,200 there. The kind of sums that can disappear inside a busy life if you're not paying attention. I was paying attention. The third thing I found was a lease agreement. Caleb had rented an apartment in Noda, the arts district on the north side of Charlotte, in August. 2 months before he claimed to have realized our marriage was struggling. He had been planning the exit while sitting across from me at dinner, while coming to appointments with me, while telling me he was in this with me. I want to say that discovering this made me furious, and it did. But it also did something else. It sharpened me. Because now I was not a woman being left. I was a woman being deceived by someone who thought I wouldn't notice, and those are very different situations with very different responses. I hired a forensic accountant. This was not cheap, but I was still employed, still had my own savings, and I had already accepted that this was going to cost me more than I wanted to spend. The accountant's name was Mr. Reinhold, and he was quiet and methodical in the way I appreciate in professionals. He spent 3 weeks going through the joint finances. Not just the current accounts, but the history going back 2 years. What he found was not spectacular. It was not the kind of thing that makes headlines, but it was enough. Caleb had been padding his expense reports at work. Not by enormous amounts, but steadily. He would take clients to dinner for $200 and submit for $350. He had billed for a conference in Atlanta he attended while also expensing a separate, personal hotel room in the same city on the same dates. Over 18 months, Mr. Reinhold estimated he had misappropriated somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000 from his employer. Small enough to avoid triggering automatic audits. Large enough, once documented, to matter. I sat with that information for a while before I decided what to do with it. I also sat with the knowledge of the joint marital account withdrawals, which Mr. Reinhold had traced to a credit card that Caleb had opened in his name alone 6 months into our marriage. He had been making cash withdrawals and transferring them to this card, which was used, among other things, to pay for the beach trip to Hilton Head. In North Carolina, dissipation of marital assets is taken seriously. My attorney's name was Ms. Paulson, and she had the kind of calm, unhurried manner that suggests she has seen everything and is surprised by very little of it. When I laid out what Mr. Reinhold had found, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Let me make some calls." Meanwhile, Caleb and Abby had apparently decided that the appropriate timeline for going public with their relationship was somewhere around 5 months after he moved out. This did not surprise me. It's roughly consistent with how these things go when people have been together longer than they've admitted to. They came to a family event. My cousin Bethany's engagement party, held at an event venue in Lake Norman, about 30 minutes outside Charlotte. I was already there when they arrived. I was wearing a green dress that I had bought specifically for this occasion, not to impress anyone, but because green is a color I look good in, and I had decided some time ago that I would not give either of them the satisfaction of seeing me diminished. I was standing near the bar with a glass of sparkling water when I saw them come in through the side entrance. Caleb saw me first. He said something to Abby that made her look up. They approached together, which I give them minimal credit for. It would have been more cowardly to avoid me, and at least they were not doing that. "Wren," Caleb said. He had the expression men get when they've done something they know was wrong, but have constructed enough internal justification that they've mostly stopped feeling bad about it. I didn't know you were going to be here. It's my cousin's party, I said. Abby reached for my arm, which I moved slightly so she couldn't quite reach it. Wren, I really hope we can talk. I know, I said. There's just a lot going on right now with the settlement, so I'm going to hold off on any personal conversations until that's wrapped up. You understand? Caleb's expression shifted. The settlement is. There's nothing complicated about the settlement. We agreed. Things have developed, I said. My attorney will be in touch. I turned and went to find my cousin, who I genuinely wanted to celebrate with, and I did not look back. I heard later, through my mother, who had stopped pretending to be neutral about 6 weeks into this, that Caleb had seemed rattled for the rest of the party. Good. Rattled was exactly right. He had assumed the settlement would be clean and quick because he had assumed I had nothing to negotiate with. He was wrong on both counts. What followed was about 4 months of legal back and forth that I will compress here because the procedural details are not the interesting part. What matters is the outcome. The forensic accounting report was submitted as part of discovery. This had two effects. The first was that the marital asset dissipation, the hidden credit card, the cash withdrawals that funded a relationship he was conducting while married to me, resulted in a significantly unequal division of our joint assets in my favor. North Carolina courts don't automatically award extra to the wronged spouse in a standard no-fault divorce, but dissipation of marital assets is a different matter. My attorney was effective. The second effect was that the expense report fraud, once documented and submitted, made its way, through channels I was not directly involved in orchestrating, to Caleb's employer. I did not call his company. I did not send anything directly. But discovery documents, once they exist, have a way of becoming known to interested parties. He was terminated in March. The official reason, as I understood it, was a violation of the company's expense reimbursement policy. He did not face criminal charges. The amounts, while not trivial, were below the threshold that typically prompts prosecution, and his employer chose to handle it internally. But he lost the job that had been his primary income and his primary identity, and the medical device industry in this region is not large. Word travels. By April, he and Abby had moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in South End, noticeably smaller than the house we had shared. I heard this from my mother with the particular tone she reserves for information she thinks I need even if I didn't ask for it, and I appreciated her for it. Now, I want to be honest here because this story deserves honesty. There was a moment, maybe 6 weeks after the settlement was finalized, on a Tuesday morning, when I was making coffee and Frank was underfoot, and the light was coming through the kitchen window the way it does in early spring in Charlotte, sort of gold and tentative, and I just sat down on the floor, not dramatically. I just sat down and leaned against the cabinet and cried for a little while. Not for Caleb exactly, not even for the marriage. For the version of the future I'd been building toward. The kids I'd imagined, the house I'd thought was permanent, the sister I'd thought I could trust with anything. Frank climbed into my lap, which given his size required some creative repositioning, and I held on to him for longer than I'd like to admit, and then I got up and made my coffee and went to work. That is actually the most important part of the story, I think. The getting up, not because I had somewhere dramatic to be or because karma was about to deliver anything extraordinary, just because that's what you do. You get up and you go and you figure out what's next. What was next for me was a promotion. I had been passed over the previous year for a senior actuary position that I was qualified for, and I had accepted this with the kind of quiet professional disappointment I'd been trained not to show. My manager, who had left in January, had been replaced by a woman who reviewed the team methodically and made her own assessments. In May, she offered me the role. I took it. I also, that same spring, went back to the fertility specialist. Not because I had a partner, not because I had a plan, but because I had spent 2 years letting my reproductive timeline be defined by a marriage that no longer existed, and I wanted my own information. The doctor, a different one this time, someone I'd chosen specifically for her communication style, sat with me for an hour and we talked through options that I could pursue on my own timeline, for my own reasons, with frozen embryos if I chose and no one else's permission required. I am not going to tell you I have it all figured out. I don't. But for the first time in a long time, the decisions about my life feel like mine. The last time I saw Caleb was in September, about 16 months after he first left. It was at a restaurant downtown, Kindred, the one on Trade Street, and I was there with a friend from work and he was there with Abby and 2 other people I didn't recognize. He saw me across the room. I saw him. We both looked away without acknowledging each other, which felt like the appropriate ending to whatever we had been to each other. Abby caught my eye for a second before she looked away too. She looked tired. Not unhappy necessarily, but tired in the particular way of someone who has been performing a version of herself for a long time and is starting to feel the cost of it. I don't wish her harm. I want to be honest about that as well. What she did was a betrayal that I don't think I will ever fully forgive, and I have made peace with the fact that we are not people who will ever be close again, but she is still my sister, in some technical and permanent biological sense, and the grief of losing that relationship is something I carry quietly. What I don't carry is bitterness. I've set it down, not for anyone else's benefit, not because I think forgiveness is some virtue I owe to the people who hurt me, but because bitterness is expensive and I am, at my core, a woman who understands the cost of things she's choosing to hold on to. My house is mine, my salary is higher, my dog remains unreasonably cheerful. My future is, for the first time in years, entirely open, which is terrifying, and also, some mornings, quietly exhilarating. I did not fall apart, and I genuinely think, that was the best revenge of all.